Welcome to Novel Ideas, Chats with Local Authors. I'm Carolyn Luck, a Framingham author, and this is our co-host, Josh Brogadir.
Great to be with you, Carol, as always. Thanks.
Josh, with all your experience as a middle school teacher here at Walsh, a reporter for 12 years, a book narrator, and now an actor, you add so much to our discussions.
Thanks.
Today's guest is Laura Woollett, who grew up in Connecticut and is currently a Framingham resident. She writes history and mystery for children and young adults. Laura's master's degree is from Simmons College in Children's Literature.
And welcome, Laura. We're glad to have you with us. So this book, your first book, Big Top Burning, is actually a true story, and it's about the true story of an arsonist, a missing girl, and the greatest show on earth. If you could tell us just a little bit about what is this book about?
Sure. So Big Top Burning is about the 1944 Hartford Circus fire and Ringling Brothers Circus. And the book is really about this tragedy, a fire that happened that day in 1944. And it's also about a couple of mysteries that surround the fire. How did the fire start? Was it an accident or was it arson? And also it's about the mystery of this little girl, an unidentified body. They called her Little Miss 1565. And who was she? And why did she go unidentified for over 50 years?
Laura, the story begins with a really happy and exciting day, and everyone's all anxious to go to the circus. And I mean, this was a really big deal. I remember when I was a kid going to the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus in Virginia, and it was like, wow. But how do you bring that excitement from the historical perspective? I mean, this was decades ago to today for your readers.
Yeah. I think that today, of course, people are still going to the Ringling Brothers Circus, and it's a spectacular event, and I got to go as part of my research, which was really fun. And they do a lot of the same things. They still have the animal menagerie before the circus begins. You can go ahead of time, and you can go see the performers on the floor ahead of time, which is really cool. But I think that back in 1944, it was a huge deal when the circus came to town. And people would plan for months to go. They would save their money. You know, it was 1944, so there wasn't a lot of money. And it was a sad time and a tough time for people. And being able to go to the circus and forget your troubles was a huge deal.
Right in the middle of the war, obviously. And specifically with this book is geared not toward adults per se, but really kind of a middle-age reader. So yep. When we're talking about that, that's an interesting challenge, I would imagine, to try to find your voice and have kids understand that.
Yeah, I think that I wanted to find ways that kids could identify with what it was like at the time. To see how children were affected by the disaster was really important to me. Not only how children might have been injured in the disaster, but also how they survived and how they used their ingenuity to survive. And also how children helped in the aftermath in ways that we would shelter children today, but actually after the fire happened, children like the Boy Scouts ran messages between the circus fire grounds and the police station. They did all sorts of things to try to help each other. And I think that's a powerful message.
Mm-hmm. You start to build suspense in the first chapter when the circus train is late. And you leave us with this sentence: many performers were superstitious about missing a show and considered their late arrival a bad omen. A late arrival seems to be one part of sort of the perfect storm building up to this. And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what happens, or fill us in there.
Yeah. So the circus train was late arriving, which did start off this chain of events that led to the fire. Because the train was late, they had trouble setting up, and they were not able to have their matinee show, which the circus always has their show. This was a huge deal that they were not able to do that. And people who were supposed to go the day before, on the 5th, actually had to come back the next day. But the big deal with coming late was that the circus was not properly inspected for safety. And so the inspector came around but nothing was set up. And then he came around again later and things were still not ready. So he never noticed that there weren't any fire extinguishers set up in the tent. He never noticed that the fire safety equipment did not attach to the fire hydrants, that did not work, that there were all the no smoking signs, none of them were put up. So none of these safety precautions were done. The exits, and one of the major things was that the exits were going to be blocked by these big 3-foot high animal chutes, these cages where the animals would come in and out during one of the acts. And unfortunately, during the fire, those cages were still there. And so 2 of the exits were blocked by those cages. And so arriving late allowed the inspector to not see what was going on. And because he felt, things had been fine in past years, give me 50 free passes and I'll sign your permit.
Wow. And obviously we know lives were lost. Can you actually read a little part of the passage and give us a little bit of a flavor for what the book is about?
Sure.
Thanks.
Would you like me to read the prologue?
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay. Some say they saw the flickering of a small flame on the sidewall of the tent just above the men's bathroom. At first, no one moved. Surely the circus staff had it under control. But by the time circus workers reached the fire, their meager buckets of water had little effect. As the crowd watched, the flame grew, spidering up the tent wall. Then someone yelled, "Fire!" and the panic began. A frightened crowd of 6,000 spectators began jostling down the rickety bleachers and across the grandstand toward the exits. The mob shoved aside folding chairs and anything else in the way. People tripped and fell. Some women and children were plucked up off the ground by kind, strong hands. Others were trampled under the rush of frantic feet. A crush of bodies pushed toward the main entrance on the west end of the tent. The northeast and northwest exits were blocked by tall steel chutes where snarling panthers still prowled inside. Meanwhile, the blaze spread across the ceiling of the massive big top, fueled by a mixture of wax and gasoline that was used to waterproof the tent. Pieces of flaming canvas floated to the ground, and black smoke billowed, making it difficult to breathe. As the fire grew, the tent became an oven. Parents desperately struggled to hold on to their small children as everyone was swept along in the swarm of people rushing toward the exits. The tent burned to the ground in fewer than 10 minutes, and 167 people died. It was one of the worst tragedies the country had ever seen. From the ashes, questions arose. How did the fire start? Was it an accident? Could a madman have set it on purpose? Who cared for the people who survived? Who were the victims? And how did the investigators identify them from their charred remains? The mysteries surrounding the Hartford Circus fire are still being explored today, more than 70 years after the disaster occurred. Professionals and amateurs alike have examined the evidence and argued their theories. Now it's your turn.
Wow, you've done a great job dragging the reader right into the bedlam of what was going on in this whole scene. I mean, it sort of leaves you almost aghast, going, oh my gosh, and 167 people was a lot of lives to lose. I think that you brought up a question of was this an accident? There's something about a shady character involved in this story. Maybe you want to elaborate on him.
Sure. So Robert C.G. was a 15-year-old boy who had joined the circus just before the Hartford shows. And he joined up in Maine. He had run away from home. And this young man was very troubled. And the more I learned about him, it became clear that this young man was very disturbed. And he did not do well in school. He had a low IQ. His father was very cruel to him, so he had a difficult home life. And so when he ran away to the circus, I assume he was looking for something better. But unfortunately, some of his bad behaviors seemed to have followed him. So when he was young, his family moved several times because of suspicious fires that happened around his house. So he had been known by the locals to have set fires in the past. And when he came to the circus, there were some suspicious fires in the shows before Hartford. Small fires on the tent ropes and things like that, but that was not uncommon at the time. People smoked a lot at that time, so it was easy that you could throw a match and a little fire started. It was very dry on the circus. There was a lot of hay and things like that. So fires were not uncommon, but they were easily put out. This Hartford fire was a different story. So the question is, with his background, did Robert Seegee set the fire? And he was under suspicion, though not at the time of the fire. It wasn't till later, in 1950, when he was convicted of setting a fire in Ohio.
Now, he was in Portland, Maine before he came to Hartford.
That's right.
Okay. So there's another New England connection there, obviously, and this came from Providence. I mean, people who live in this area have seen the circus and know what the circus is like, but that kind of a disaster today, with some of the changes in codes and things, we wouldn't be talking about that same thing today. And that's part of your research. You figured that out.
Yeah, and I think that that's an important thing to talk about with young people, especially. You know, so this tragedy happened and it was awful, but what kinds of things came out of it that improved safety for everyone at these kinds of events? So at the time, as I read, tents were often waterproofed with a mixture of wax and gasoline, which is highly flammable.
Yeah, it almost seems ridiculous to even think that could happen, but that's how they were able to do that so that it didn't get wet, right?
That was the traditional method. And during the war, there were some waterproof tenting materials, but it was difficult to get them because they were being used for the war effort. And that's what Ringling Brothers claimed. But after the Hartford Circus fire, many changes went into effect. One specific change was that ambulances and police officers, when they're traveling to an emergency, they now have to have their sirens on. They did not have to have their sirens on in 1944. In 1944, the fire department was actually never officially told that the circus was in town. The circus was responsible for its own fire safety equipment. And so that would never happen today.
So tell us, does the reader find out the truth at the end of the story about what actually happened?
Well, I think that one of the really amazing things about this story is the unsolved nature of the mysteries. Now, some people will claim they have been solved, and some people will say they're unsolved. And that's why I felt like this was a great book for young kids, because they can read the evidence and decide for themselves what they think. And I think that this book is, in fact, one of the most transparent in the research, and so that kids can use the back matter, the references, and the source notes to go back and do their own research and think about, you know, do I think it was Robert Seegee, the teenage arsonist? And that they can think about that for themselves.
We're speaking with Laura Woollett. This is Big Top Burning, and we'll be back after a short break.
Todd's a great guy. I mean, look at him. What a sweetheart. Attaboy. Wait, Todd, what are you doing? How totally selfish and un-Todd-like of you. Come on, Todd. Come on, man.
Morning, Gary. We are GetSchooled.com. You want a college education, don't you?
You know you do.
Yeah,
But I don't know where to start.
that's why we're here. We're free, handsome,
I think we're breathtaking.
and here to guide you through every step of the way, starting with attendance. Gary, financial aid forms. Biology homework, G. I got this. Is that Bran? Colleges love extracurricular activities.
Chess really isn't my thing.
I got this. Doesn't matter. Go ahead. Picking a college, man. You and us. We go together like tacos and Tuesday.
And I love tacos.
Fire and ice.
Those don't really go together. Go to getschool.com for more info.
And welcome back to Novel Ideas. We're here with Laura Woollett, local author, Framingham resident, and her book Big Top Burning, all about the 1944 Circus fire in Hartford, Connecticut. Laura, again, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So your quest to be an author didn't just happen yesterday. This is something you've been thinking about, I would imagine, for quite a while. Tell us about how you got into this.
Yeah. My journey to publish Big Top Burning took 10 years. And that's, I've heard, fairly typical. But a lot of people say that they wanted to be writers when they were kids, and I don't know that I did, but I love to read. I really love to read. So I read a lot of mysteries, which kind of shows up in this book.
Sure.
I read a lot of mysteries. They were very important in my household. We read Agatha Christie. We watched Spencer for Hire. It was great. And I loved Stephen King. Mm-hmm. But I also loved things like L.M. Montgomery, kind of historical fiction. So I think coming at it from being a reader, and then when I went to graduate school and I studied children's literature, hoping to become a children's book editor, I really learned a lot about how great nonfiction can be for kids. And it's not the dry stuff that perhaps was around in the 80s when I was growing up, but in really engaging stories that are told like stories, where history comes alive because you've got characters, like in Big Top Burning, you've got the Cook family, and you've got Robert Siege, and that there could be hooks at the ends of chapters and rising tension, and that it reads like a novel. And so that's when I decided I wanted to write a disaster story for kids.
Yeah, Laura, you did an awful lot of research for this book, and just there's pages and pages at the end of references and so on. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit, I mean, this book here started with the research, or, you know, tell us about your writing process.
Yep. So the research process. So I actually began this as a project for graduate school back in 2005, and I began researching by looking at newspaper articles. And then I started interviewing survivors, which was one of the most amazing parts of the journey, and finding out what it was really like to live in 1944, what it was really like to be at the circus, the excitement that these people who were kids at that time had, and also their amazing stories of survival. And it was so incredible to go to some of these memorial gatherings that are where survivors come back and they share their stories, and I was so honored that they shared them with me. So really the research started with that, and then going back, writing a draft, going back, researching in the archives, rewriting the draft, submitting, and all of that, until I found the right publisher with Chicago Review Press, who publishes all nonfiction for young people and for adults.
You grew up near Hartford, not in Hartford, South Windsor?
I grew up in South
Connecticut?
Windsor, yes.
So you didn't grow up with this story as part of your life, but how much did you hear as a child or as you were growing up from people who lived nearby? Did they talk about that Hartford Circus fire, or tell us about that?
Yeah, people did talk about it. I remember it being in the paper every year at the anniversary, and it's still covered in the news every year, and it's 72 years later. Wow. It affected the community so much. And one of the things that really affected the community was the story of Little Miss 1565, which I kind of touched on. But she was a little girl who had died in the fire, and she went unidentified for over 50 years. And they gave her that nickname. 1565 was her morgue number, and she was about 8 years old. And people wanted to find out who she was. And so they would run her morgue photo in the newspaper every year. Does anyone know who this girl is? And so a lot of the book talks about that mystery and trying to figure out who is this little girl and can we bring her home?
Yeah, you gave a lot of clues throughout the book on that. By nature of the book and the story, it's really plot driven. And yet you do an amazing job of really making the characters live. I mean, from the police commissioner and from the, villain and from these other folks in the story. I mean, the mother that was up in Southampton and the aunt and uncle and so on. And it's just really amazing. Would you like to tell us about your favorite character?
Oh, sure. Well, I really love the story of Little Miss 1565, of course. Potentially Eleanor Cook. So are they the same person or not? That is a question that we ask in the book. It was really important to me to make, as I said before, make this sound like a story. And so I really had to think about characters a lot. And Eleanor Cook was a little girl who was 8 years old, and she was at the circus that day and never came home. And so a lot of people have tied her to this unidentified little girl. But there are reasons why it might not be her.
Right. Forensics.
Forensic.
For one
the
thing,
lack of forensics.
I was about to say. We touched just a little bit before on how this kind of a disaster might not be able to happen today, hopefully wouldn't happen today, or certainly not of the magnitude of 167 in the fire. But also, they didn't have DNA analysis that they do today.
No.
And so that's something, we positively would be able to know if, in fact, this was Eleanor Cook, but they couldn't do that back then.
They could not do that back then. And they could do things like check dental records, but at the time, Eleanor Cook's dentist was out of the country. And of course, in the time of no cell phones and things, there was no way to get her dental records in time. And, her family just wanted closure. And so they did go around the block quite a bit trying to figure out, was it Eleanor? And they kept coming back to it. But in the end, ultimately, at the time, in the 40s, her family said no and just said, let's just put this to rest.
Did you ever find out why they didn't want to hold the body and sort of wait and try to find out positively when the dentist perhaps returned, or that wasn't the custom?
I just don't think that was something that was done. And Eleanor Cook's aunts, who were very close to her, she in fact lived with her aunts while her mother worked in Hartford because of some strange family circumstances. So her aunts, she called them Mom. And so when her aunts saw the body, they said no, it wasn't her. And so they were satisfied with that. And that's really why they said, okay, let's just stop this.
Yeah, she had an older brother as well.
She did.
I mean, Donald was still alive for many years afterwards, and
Yeah.
he escaped the fire in sort of a neat little way.
Yeah, he jumped down the back of the bleachers to get out and lifted the tent and went underneath. Whereas Eleanor and her mom and her brother went down to the main entrance, which of course was very crowded and made it impossible for them to get out.
There's so many mysteries with this that we want to talk about another mystery, which is the Great Connecticut Caper. Tell us about that.
Oh, yes. So this project was really fun. I worked kind of collaboratively with 12 other authors and illustrators from Connecticut. It was done in the style of this parlor game called The Exquisite Corpse. And so this book is for, I would say, elementary school age kids. It's a mystery about Gillette Castle, which is a landmark in Connecticut, goes missing. So where did it go? How did it disappear? How did a whole castle disappear? And so the way we wrote it was that one author began with chapter 1 and then passed it to author 2, and they wrote chapter 2 and then passed it on. So when I wrote chapter 4, I only had chapters 1 through 3 to go on. And I had no idea how it would end until it was published.
Wow. It's like a game of telephone, but with fantastic authors continuing each stretch of that.
It was a lot of fun.
That's really neat.
Were you surprised at the ending when you got to read it?
I was. I couldn't believe that the authors at the end were able to pull all those strings together. It was really great. And you can find this book through Connecticut Humanities, which is an organization, nonprofit organization in Connecticut. It's available for free online.
In terms of this writing and others, so this is nonfiction, that's clearly fiction. The direction you feel like your writing career is headed, will you continue to do both? Are you more of a nonfiction writer, do you think? Or tell us about your path, so to speak.
Well, I love research. I could just live in research. But eventually you have to write the book, unfortunately. That's the hard part. So I'm really interested in character development and telling stories. And so I'm really interested in working on historical fiction next. So what I'm doing is I'm taking kind of my love of the Stephen King, the Gothic, and also my love of U.S. history, and merging them into a historical fiction set in the 1830s Waltham, Massachusetts.
Ooh, so that's what's next from Laura Woollett.
Yes.
The tease for your readers and our viewers. It's terrific.
Yeah. Would you like to give us some advice to aspiring authors? If you had anything.
Persistence. So it took 10 years for me to get my book published. In the past, I have also written which I affectionately call my drawer novel, which is the novel that will go in a drawer and stay there forever because it was practice and not any good, because sometimes you have to do those to get to the real novel. But persistence. I truly believe in the Malcolm Gladwell's theory of the 10,000 hours of practice make you good. Like the Beatles played for 10,000 hours before they made it big. I believe in that. So writing is a craft that you have to practice, and so just keep writing.
Yeah.
And reading.
Yeah.
Do you find it difficult? You have a couple of kids yourself?
I have a daughter. She's 4.
She's 4. How challenging is it for you to find the time to do this research and to do the writing? Because there are plenty of parents out there who might aspire to do this, but that may be a tricky thing. How do you find that balance?
It is hard, and I learned that you just write in the spare moments, in the 20 minutes while you're waiting for them at swim lessons, or, I'm always thinking of ideas. So even in the grocery store, I'm like, oh, I'm going to be in this line for 10 minutes. So let me think, how can I solve that plot problem? So just kind of always staying with the story and never leaving it.
Well, Laura Woollett, it's been wonderful having you with us today. Her book, of course, is Big Top Burning, the true story of an arsonist, a missing girl, and the greatest show on earth. Laura Woolett's book. Thank you so much.
We're delighted to have this program that allows us to celebrate some of our town's wonderful talent. We've been through several shows, and we'd really like to thank Laura for being with us tonight. We really enjoy hearing about your work and are looking forward to checking out this great Connecticut caper and what you have coming down the pike next. Laura and I actually know each other from the Writer's Loft, and we'd like to give a shout out to all our friends there on the show this evening.
Terrific. And some of our next shows, by the way, will feature Christopher Golden, a New York Times bestseller, Carrie Johnson, author of Hot Flash, and Framingham historian Frederick Wallace, just to name a few. We'll be with you each month here on Novel Ideas, so we thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh, my awesome co-host. You're just great. And many thanks to the crew and everyone here at Access Framingham Television. You've done a great job for us. Most of all, we'd like to thank you, our viewers, for joining us for Novel Ideas, and we'll see you next time.